Judge Thomas Patterson adjusted his glasses, his gaze fixed on the case file before him. The courtroom buzzed with the usual low hum of impatient conversations as lawyers, defendants, and witnesses waited for their cases to be heard. It was another busy Tuesday morning, just another day in his long career as a judge in the small city of Monroe. The names in his docket didn't excite him. The disputes were typical, trivial, even, and the defendant before him now, Dr. Nia Williams, seemed no different. She stood tall and composed, a stark contrast to the usual anxious demeanor of those who found themselves on the wrong side of the law. With her poised presence and calm voice, it was clear that Dr. Williams was accustomed to high-pressure situations. She had an air of quiet authority that intrigued Patterson, though he didn't dwell on it. His job was straightforward: deliver fair judgments based on the law, not to question motives or dig into the lives of those in his courtroom. "Dr. Williams," Judge Patterson said, his voice carrying across the room, "you've been accused of minor zoning infractions related to your nonprofit organization's new community center. It appears that your application was missing some required documents. The fine for this infraction stands at $500, which I'm sure you'll agree is a reasonable penalty given the circumstances." Dr. Williams nodded, her face betraying no emotion. "I understand, Your Honor, and I'll make sure the proper paperwork is submitted moving forward," she replied in a measured tone, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that commanded respect. There was nothing about her that seemed out of the ordinary, Patterson thought. She didn't plead for mercy, didn't argue the fine, nor did she attempt to deflect blame onto others. She accepted her fate with grace, almost as if she expected this minor setback. Patterson, who had seen countless defendants plead, argue, or even beg for leniency, was taken aback by her calm acceptance. It was as though the $500 fine meant little to her. He assumed it was just part of the routine. Someone like her, an educated woman, surely had the resources to pay it without issue. "I'll sign the order," Patterson said, signaling the clerk to finalize the paperwork. "The case is dismissed with the fine. Court will reconvene in 15 minutes. As Dr. Williams turned to leave, Patterson briefly met her eyes. There was something in her gaze, a sense of determination, perhaps, though it was fleeting. She offered a polite nod and left the courtroom without fanfare, disappearing into the hallway. Patterson returned to his notes, already moving on to the next case. But in the back of his mind, something lingered. Who was this woman? What did she do? Little did he know, that moment would mark the beginning of a journey that would change everything. While Judge Patterson moved on to the next case, Dr. Nia Williams was already stepping into a world far removed from the small courthouse. She wasn't just a woman handling minor legal inconveniences. She was someone at the forefront of a global movement, an invisible architect shaping the future of government leadership and public accountability. As soon as she exited the courtroom, her phone buzzed with a series of messages from her team, each one detailing new developments in her ongoing projects. Dr. Williams had spent years quietly building a reputation among international policymakers, but her work rarely made headlines. She preferred it that way. Avoiding the limelight allowed her to influence from behind the scenes, with fewer obstacles from those resistant to change. Her nonprofit organization, Transparency First, focused on developing systems for promoting ethical leadership across the globe. What most people didn't realize was that Dr. Williams wasn't just an activist. She was a brilliant strategist who had worked with governments, think tanks, and major organizations to overhaul outdated leadership models. Her methods combined cutting-edge technology with deep insights into human behavior, creating a framework for accountability that was revolutionizing public service. She designed tools for governments to measure and improve the effectiveness of their leaders, blending data analytics with policy reforms that empowered citizens to hold officials to account. Despite the challenges she faced, Dr. Williams had begun to see results. In several countries where her ideas had been implemented, corruption rates were decreasing and trust in leadership was on the rise. The very systems that once seemed untouchable were slowly being dismantled from within. But her work wasn't without risks. There were powerful figures, politicians, business magnates, and even rogue international organizations who would stop at nothing to maintain the status quo. These were the same forces that could make her disappear, either through threats or more subtle methods of silencing dissent. As she entered her office, Dr. Williams was greeted by her small, dedicated team. They were all aware of the significance of their mission, but also of the dangers that came with it. On the desk before her sat a proposal for an upcoming international summit, an invitation she had received only a few days before. The event promised to bring together some of the most influential minds in political reform, and it was the perfect platform to share her latest initiative, a comprehensive blueprint for worldwide leadership transformation. Her team knew this summit would be a defining moment for their work. If successful, it could open doors to even larger-scale reform efforts. But the risks were higher than ever. The world was changing, and so was her role in it. Dr. Williams had no illusions. Her involvement in this field came with great personal cost. Yet the possibility of creating lasting change kept her going, even when the stakes seemed impossibly high. She knew that her journey had only just begun. A few weeks after the court case, Judge Patterson's life returned to its usual rhythm. The hustle and bustle of courtroom proceedings consumed his days, with each case blending into the next. He had nearly forgotten about Dr. Nia Williams, the composed defendant who had barely reacted when fined. Yet that brief interaction continued to nag at him. There was something about her that didn't quite fit the mold of the typical case he handled. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk reviewing upcoming hearings, an envelope arrived in the mail. It was sealed with an emblem he didn't recognize. He opened it and found an invitation to an exclusive international summit on political and social reform. The letter was printed on thick, luxurious paper and signed by some of the most respected leaders in the field. The event would bring together experts from around the world to discuss transformative changes in government, ethics in leadership, and public accountability. Judge Patterson's eyebrows furrowed as he skimmed the details. Among the speakers was a name he immediately recognized, Dr. Nia Williams, the same woman who had appeared in his courtroom just a few weeks ago. He paused, his mind racing. How could this be? The woman he had fined for a minor zoning issue was now a key figure in a global movement. The invitation intrigued him, but also left him with a sense of unease. Patterson had spent years in the judicial system, and he knew how easy it was to misjudge people based on surface appearances. Dr. Williams, with her calm, professional demeanor in court, hadn't shown any signs of being more than an everyday defendant. Yet the invitation painted a very different picture, a picture of someone who was shaping the future of governance on a global scale. Unable to shake his curiosity, Patterson decided to attend the summit. It was scheduled to take place in a week, in a city known for its international political influence. He reasoned that, as a judge committed to upholding fairness and understanding the wider scope of legal and political systems, it would be worthwhile to learn more about Dr. Williams' work. At the very least, he would hear her side of the story. After all, he'd made a decision in her case without knowing anything about her true impact. When the day of the summit arrived, Patterson found himself in an opulent conference hall filled with high-profile politicians, activists, and renowned experts from every corner of the globe. He marveled at the diversity of voices and the energy that filled the room. As the sessions began, the gravity of the discussions took him by surprise. People were talking about changing the world, not just in theory, but with practical, actionable solutions. Dr. Williams was set to speak in the afternoon session. As Patterson took his seat among the audience, his anticipation grew. He had no idea that this event would challenge everything he thought he knew about leadership, justice, and the potential for change. When Dr. Williams took the stage, he immediately recognized the poised figure from the courtroom. But this time, her presence was electric. There was no trace of the calm resignation he had seen in court. Instead, she stood before the crowd with a quiet yet powerful authority that commanded their full attention. Her voice, steady and compelling, filled the hall as she began speaking about her vision for reforming the world's political systems. Judge Patterson, sitting in the audience, listened intently, the weight of his earlier decision hitting him in waves. He realized, with growing astonishment, that the woman he had dismissed as a mere defendant was in fact shaping the future of governance. Judge Patterson sat back in his chair, eyes fixed on Dr. Nia Williams as she spoke at the summit. Her words were eloquent, her voice steady and assured. She wasn't just talking about theories or abstract ideas. She was presenting tangible, actionable strategies that could fundamentally change how governments operated around the world. The complexity of the subject matter didn't intimidate her. Instead, she made it feel approachable, even urgent. Her vision was grand, but it was grounded in real-world solutions, and Patterson was captivated. Dr. Williams spoke about a multi-layered approach to leadership reform, one that combined technology with grassroots activism. She outlined how governments could use data to measure the effectiveness of their leaders and hold them accountable to the people they served. Her ideas were bold, but they weren't just theoretical. She had already implemented some of these strategies in several countries, achieving measurable success in reducing corruption and increasing transparency in government operations. Patterson had never imagined that the calm woman who had stood before him in court was a force behind such groundbreaking work. The audience was riveted. Patterson found himself shifting uncomfortably in his seat as the realization sank in. He had made a judgment about Dr. Williams, an assumption based solely on a brief courtroom interaction, and had dismissed her as just another minor defendant. Yet here she was, standing at the forefront of global change, shaping the future of political governance. He thought back to the courtroom scene just weeks before. He had been so quick to impose a fine on her, assuming that the small infraction was the extent of her impact. The woman he had judged based on a simple zoning issue had been influencing global leaders, challenging the very systems that had long been untouchable. The guilt washed over him in a rush. How had he failed to see who she truly was? And worse, how had he let his ignorance shape his decision in the courtroom? Dr. Williams continued her presentation, her passion unmistakable. She spoke about the importance of ethical leadership, of using power responsibly, and in service of the people. She outlined the work she was doing to help governments around the world adopt more transparent practices and remove barriers that allowed corruption to thrive. There was no doubt in her words. This wasn't just a passion project for her. This was her life's work. As the session drew to a close, Patterson sat in stunned silence, reflecting on the magnitude of what he had just learned. He had seen a completely different side of Dr. Williams, one that hadn't been apparent in their brief interaction in the courtroom. She wasn't just a defendant in a small legal case. She was a global leader, someone whose work had the potential to reshape the very systems of power that he had spent his life upholding. He couldn't shake the thought. What if he had been wrong? What if his decision to fine her had been a mistake? As the summit wrapped up for the day, Judge Patterson's mind raced with thoughts of Dr. Williams. He couldn't focus on the remaining sessions. Her words had resonated deeply, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized how misguided his earlier judgment had been. He had sentenced her to a fine, dismissing her as just another defendant caught up in an unimportant legal matter. But now, seeing her on stage, speaking with such authority and vision, he realized that he had underestimated her. And the consequences of that decision weighed heavily on him. Patterson made his decision then and there. He couldn't just sit back and let the mistake go unacknowledged. He had to apologize, and not just as a judge, but as a person who had wrongly judged someone based on a surface-level interaction. This wasn't about clearing his conscience. It was about recognizing the error he had made and offering genuine remorse for it. The next morning, after the summit had resumed, Patterson sought out Dr. Williams. He found her in a quiet corner of the event hall, surrounded by a small group of colleagues. He hesitated at first, unsure of how to approach her. After all, who was he to interrupt a woman so clearly at the forefront of such important work? But he knew he couldn't leave without speaking to her. Taking a deep breath, Patterson approached, his hands slightly clammy. When Dr. Williams saw him, her expression didn't change. She didn't offer a smile or a nod, but her gaze met his without judgment. There was no sign of the cold detachment he had expected, only the quiet intensity that seemed to follow her everywhere. "Dr. Williams," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. I owe you an apology. I don't know if you remember, but I was the judge who fined you for that zoning issue in Monroe. At the time, I didn't understand who you were or what you were truly doing. But after hearing you speak here, I realized just how wrong I was." Dr. Williams studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Patterson felt a pang of anxiety as the silence stretched between them. He wondered if she would dismiss him, or worse, scorn his sudden self-awareness. But to his surprise, she didn't do either. "I do remember you, Judge Patterson," she said calmly, her voice as composed as ever. "And I also understand that people sometimes make decisions without the full picture. We all do it. But it's rare to see someone own up to their mistakes, especially when the stakes are this high." Patterson was taken aback by her response. He had expected some measure of distance or even resistance, but instead, she spoke with a level of understanding that left him momentarily speechless. "I misjudged you," he continued, finding his voice again. "I assumed your work was small, inconsequential, just a paperwork mistake. But now I see that you're doing something far greater, something that can change the world. I wanted to apologize for not recognizing that sooner." Dr. Williams gave a slight nod, her eyes softening, though she remained composed. "I appreciate your apology, Judge, and I understand. But there's something I've learned in this work. You can't change the world if you're only willing to admit your mistakes in private. You have to be willing to take responsibility publicly. And that means letting others see that growth in you." The words struck Patterson deeply. He had expected an apology to ease his conscience, but instead, she had given him a lesson on integrity and leadership, one he had been blind to until now. He felt the weight of the moment, the realization that perhaps his role in this story was just beginning. "I'll do better," he said, his voice firm now. "And I'll make it right, in whatever way I can." Dr. Williams offered a small smile, the first he had seen from her. "We'll see," she replied. "But it's a start." In the days that followed, Judge Patterson found himself increasingly drawn to Dr. Williams' mission. The summit had been a wake-up call, one that opened his eyes not just to the global scale of her work, but also to the power of accountability and systemic change. He had always believed in justice, but now, for the first time, he began to question whether his role as a judge was enough to bring about the kind of sweeping reforms the world so desperately needed. After their conversation, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had an obligation to do more. Dr. Williams, too, had been reflecting on their exchange. She had seen many people over the years who had tried to apologize for their mistakes, but Patterson's sincerity had struck her differently. He wasn't simply looking for redemption. He was genuinely committed to making amends. He had stepped out of his comfort zone, not as a judge, but as a man who understood the broader implications of his actions. Dr. Williams admired that, and it wasn't lost on her that he had potential to be a powerful ally in her fight for change. It wasn't long before Patterson reached out to her again. This time, his approach was more deliberate. He wasn't simply seeking forgiveness, but offering something of value, a chance to work together. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation," Patterson began when they spoke over the phone. "And I want to help. I've seen the way your methods are changing things in other countries, and I believe I can be of service to your cause. I can't undo the fine I imposed, but I can help you in ways that align with my expertise. There's a lot about the legal system I know that could support your reforms." Dr. Williams listened attentively, impressed by his commitment. It wasn't often that someone in his position, someone so deeply entrenched in the existing legal framework, was willing to challenge that system. She had built her reputation by challenging power structures, and here was a man who had the potential to disrupt the very system he had spent his life supporting. "You've taken the first step," she said thoughtfully. "But I need more than just someone who's willing to lend their expertise. I need someone who can help me navigate the complexities of the judicial system, someone who can influence policy and inspire others to think differently about justice. I'm committed, Patterson replied without hesitation. You've shown me that the law isn't just about enforcement. It's about creating systems that truly serve the people. I'd spent too many years upholding a system that's flawed. Now, I want to be part of the solution. Their partnership began to take shape almost immediately. Patterson used his connections to help Dr. Williams make inroads with key legal institutions. They began working on new proposals for judicial reform, focusing on transparency and fairness, and how the law could better serve marginalized communities. Patterson also introduced Dr. Williams to several influential figures in the political world, helping her secure a platform for her ideas in higher circles. It wasn't long before the two of them were inseparable in their mission, their skills complementing each other in ways that neither had expected. Dr. Williams' strategic vision, combined with Patterson's legal expertise, created a formidable team. Together, they began drafting plans to implement leadership reforms, using the lessons they had learned in different parts of the world to address corruption, inequality, and lack of accountability. The journey had just begun, but it was clear to both of them that their partnership was more than just a professional one. It was a mission, and they were determined to see it through. As Patterson and Dr. Williams worked together, their progress was undeniable. Their combined efforts began to open doors, one after another. Proposals for legal and leadership reform were gaining traction, and their message of transparency, accountability, and ethical governance was being heard by influential politicians, activists, and thought leaders worldwide. Yet, despite the growing momentum, they both knew that their success would inevitably attract resistance from powerful figures who stood to lose if their work gained too much ground. The pushback came sooner than they had anticipated. One afternoon, as Patterson sat in his office reviewing legal frameworks for the proposed reforms, he received a phone call from Dr. Williams. Her voice, usually composed, had a slight edge of tension. "We have a problem," she said, her tone clipped. "It's starting." Patterson leaned forward, sensing the gravity of the situation. "What's happened?" "I've received a series of anonymous threats. Nothing overt, but enough to make it clear that some people don't like what we're doing. Our latest proposal to expand leadership audits in local governments has triggered some major backlash. There are lobbyists involved, and I'm not sure who's behind it, but they're making sure the right people hear about it." Patterson's gut tightened. He had known that there would be opposition, but hearing it from Dr. Williams, who had faced these types of challenges before, made it all the more real. "I've had my share of threats too," she continued, "but now they're getting personal. I've been followed a few times, nothing overt, but enough to make it clear I'm being watched." Patterson felt a cold knot in his stomach. "This is bigger than we thought. We can't just fight these forces through legal reform alone. We'll need to be strategic, very strategic." But as they both knew, the resistance they were facing wasn't just political or bureaucratic. It was deeply embedded in the systems of power. Corrupt leaders, business magnates, and even global organizations with vested interests in keeping things the way they were now actively working to thwart their progress. They had no intention of allowing two outsiders, one a judge, the other an activist, who penned the delicate balance they had worked so hard to maintain. The threats escalated quickly. Anonymous social media posts began to target both Dr. Williams and Patterson, questioning their credibility and casting doubt on their integrity. Rumors spread about their motivations, painting them as opportunists and power-hungry figures looking to manipulate public opinion. Financial backers who had previously supported Dr. Williams' initiatives began pulling funding, worried about the potential fallout. At the same time, Patterson's colleagues in the judicial system grew increasingly skeptical of his involvement with Dr. Williams. There were whispers in the halls, veiled comments questioning his judgment. His position was being scrutinized, and it was clear that the forces aligned against them were working tirelessly to isolate and discredit them both. But neither Dr. Williams nor Patterson was willing to back down. They knew that the fight ahead would be harder than anything they had faced so far, but they were also more certain than ever that their mission was bigger than any personal risk. "We can't let fear dictate our next move," Dr. Williams said one evening, as they sat together in her office, reviewing strategies. "This isn't just about reform. It's about creating a new narrative. And the people who are threatened by that won't stop until we're silenced. But I won't be silenced, and I know you won't either." Patterson nodded, determination hardening in his chest. "We've come too far to back out now. Let them try to stop us. We'll find a way to turn the tide." As they continued their work, the danger loomed large, but so did the opportunity to make the change they believed in. Despite the growing threats, Dr. Williams and Patterson knew one thing for certain. They were in this together, and they would fight to the end. The threats, both subtle and overt, continued to escalate, but instead of pushing them into the shadows, they only galvanized Dr. Williams and Judge Patterson. They knew the stakes had never been higher. The pressure was mounting, but so was their resolve. They had come to understand that true change was never easy. It was always met with resistance from those who benefited from the status quo. Yet the unwavering belief in their mission to reshape leadership and accountability kept them moving forward, one step at a time. One morning, Patterson received an unexpected visitor at his courthouse. It was a high-ranking government official, someone he had crossed paths with in the past, but never had a personal connection with. The official, a well-known advocate for conservative political policies, sat across from Patterson's desk, his demeanor serious but measured. "I've heard about your involvement with Dr. Williams," the official said, not bothering with pleasantries. "And I must admit, I'm not sure where you're going with this. You're playing a dangerous game." Patterson leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "What game is that?" "The one where you start questioning the very systems that uphold this country's legal and political structure," the official replied, his voice low. "You and Williams are making waves, and people are starting to pay attention, but not everyone is happy with the direction you're heading in." The implications were clear. The official wasn't there to threaten directly, but he was subtly warning Patterson of the repercussions his partnership with Dr. Williams might bring. It was a delicate dance, an attempt to persuade him to step away from her work without openly confronting him. But Patterson had already made up his mind. "I'm not interested in playing games," Patterson said calmly. "What I'm interested in is justice. Real justice, not the kind that keeps people in power while everyone else suffers. Dr. Williams is doing the hard work of pushing for a system that actually serves the people, and I'm going to help her do that." The official's face hardened, but he didn't press the issue further. Patterson could see that his commitment had shaken the man, though whether it would have any lasting effect, he wasn't sure. Regardless, the conversation made one thing clear. Dr. Williams and Patterson were no longer just up against bureaucratic resistance. They were challenging a system that had been in place for decades, if not centuries. Meanwhile, Dr. Williams was dealing with the same pushback, though in a more direct manner. One of her primary allies, a senator who had initially supported her leadership reform proposals, was now distancing himself from her. The senator's office had been flooded with calls from lobbyists and corporate interests urging him to back off from her initiatives. Dr. Williams knew this was just the beginning, but she wasn't ready to back down. As they continued their work, Patterson and Dr. Williams realized that their fight wasn't just about passing laws or influencing policy. It was about shifting the very culture of governance. It was about teaching the world that true leadership required not just power, but accountability. Together, they had already made a significant impact. Several of their proposals were gaining momentum, and some regions were beginning to adopt their framework for ethical leadership. One evening, as they stood together looking out over a bustling city, Patterson turned to Dr. Williams. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he said, a rare smile touching his lips. Dr. Williams nodded, her eyes focused on the horizon. "We have. But this is just the beginning. There's a lot more work to do." Patterson knew she was right. They had ignited a movement, but the road ahead was long. Yet for the first time in his life, he felt an overwhelming sense of purpose, a certainty that they were on the right path. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, determined to build a future where leadership was defined by integrity, accountability, and service to the people. And that, in the end, was the most powerful change they could create.